There are moments in life when a single question changes everything. When the fabric of your understanding unravels, and you're left staring at truths you've spent your entire existence avoiding. For Dr. Elena Morrison, that moment came on a Tuesday evening in September, in the most unlikely of places, a maximum security psychiatric facility outside Portland, Oregon. She'd been working there for 3 years. 3 years of clinical assessments, medication reviews, and carefully documented observations. 3 years of maintaining professional distance while treating individuals society had deemed too dangerous, too broken, or too incomprehensible to walk free among the rest of humanity. But nothing in her training had prepared her for patient 7242. Let me take you back to the beginning of this story. Not to the Tuesday when everything changed, but to 3 weeks earlier, when a file landed on Elena's desk that would gradually dismantle every certainty she'd built her career upon. The facility director, Dr. Marcus Webb, had personally delivered the file. That alone was unusual. Marcus ran the administrative side of Cedar Valley Psychiatric Hospital with the efficiency of a military operation, rarely involving himself in individual patient assignments. Yet there he stood in her doorway that Monday morning, holding a thin manila folder as if it contained something radioactive. "Elena," he'd said, his usually confident voice carrying an edge she'd never heard before. "I need you to take on a new patient. High priority. Federal transfer." She'd looked up from her computer, where she'd been reviewing treatment plans for her existing caseload. "Federal? Marcus, I'm already handling 17 patients. The recommended maximum is 12. I know." He stepped inside her office and closed the door, another unusual gesture. "This is different. This patient, there are no existing diagnoses. No treatment history. No medical records beyond basic vitals. He was found 3 months ago in the Cascade Mountains, completely unresponsive. Park rangers thought he was dead at first." Elena had taken the folder, scanning the sparse contents. The intake form was mostly blank. Age, estimated mid-30s. Height, 6 feet 2 inches. Weight, 175 pounds. No identifying marks, no wallet, no ID. Fingerprints returned no matches in any database. DNA testing revealed nothing remarkable except unusually low levels of environmental toxins, as if he'd spent his entire life in a hermetically sealed environment. "What's his diagnosis?" she'd asked. Marcus had shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "That's what we need you to determine." He was catatonic for the first 6 weeks. Then he started speaking, but not to anyone. Just observations. About the facility. About the people around him. About things he shouldn't be able to know. Shouldn't be able to know? What does that mean? He knew the name of a nurse's daughter. A daughter she'd given up for adoption 30 years ago and had never told anyone about. He described the contents of the facility director's office at the previous site where this patient was held, a site he'd never been to and couldn't have seen. He predicted a small earthquake in California 3 days before it happened. Not a major one, just a 4.2, but specific enough that people started paying attention. Elena had felt a familiar skepticism rising. "Marcus, you know there are psychological explanations for apparent precognition. Pattern recognition, unconscious environmental cues, even lucky guesses that our brains remember while forgetting the misses." "I know all that," Marcus had interrupted. "That's why I'm assigning him to you. You're the most rational psychiatrist on staff. If there's a mundane explanation, you'll find it. But Elena..." He'd paused at her door. "Keep detailed notes. Everything he says. Federal agents check in weekly for reports. This is bigger than a standard case." That should have been her first warning. Elena had approached her first session with patient 7242 the way she approached all new cases, with clinical curiosity tempered by professional caution. The secure interview rooms at Cedar Valley were designed for safety. Reinforced windows, monitored exits, panic buttons within easy reach. She'd never needed them, but their presence provided a psychological buffer between her empathy and her survival instincts. He was already seated when she entered. Not restrained, she noted. Most federal transfers came with elaborate security protocols. But patient 7242 sat calmly in a standard chair, hands folded in his lap, gazing at the wall as if reading invisible text. Her first impression was of profound stillness. Not the frozen immobility of catatonia, but the complete absence of unconscious movement. No fidgeting, no shifting, no automatic adjustments of posture. Even his breathing seemed deliberate rather than reflexive. "Good morning," Elena had said, settling into her chair with her tablet. "My name is Dr. Morrison. I'll be working with you during your stay here. How are you feeling today?" For a long moment, he didn't respond. His eyes, a distinctive gray-green that seemed to shift in the fluorescent light, remained fixed on the wall. She'd begun to note non-responsive to initial greeting when he spoke. "You don't expect me to answer that honestly." His voice was quiet but remarkably clear, with an accent she couldn't place. Not foreign exactly, but slightly off, as if English were a language he'd learned perfectly but recently. "I do expect honesty," Elena had replied, maintaining her professional calm. "This is a safe space for you to express how you're actually feeling." Safe. He'd finally turned to look at her, and she'd felt an involuntary chill. Not from threat, he radiated no aggression whatsoever, but from the quality of his attention. He looked at her the way a botanist might examine a rare specimen, with intense focus but no emotional investment. "You believe that because you've convinced yourself this room, this facility, this entire system exists to help people. But you also know, in a part of your mind you've learned to ignore, that it exists primarily for containment. To keep people like me separate from people like everyone else." Elena had written, "Demonstrates insight into institutional function. Possible defensive intellectualization. Can you tell me your name?" she'd asked. "I've had many names. None of them are mine. What would you like me to call you?" He'd considered this with what appeared to be genuine thoughtfulness. "You can call me Zeth. It's as close as your language comes to what I am." "Zeth. Thank you. Can you tell me where you're from?" "Everywhere. Nowhere." Both answers are equally true and equally meaningless to your frame of reference. Let me pause here to share something about psychiatric assessment. When evaluating a patient, we listen for specific markers: coherence of thought, appropriateness of effect, connection to consensus reality. Delusions typically follow certain patterns. Grandiosity, believing oneself to be special, chosen, or possessing extraordinary abilities. Persecution, believing others are conspiring against you. Disorganization, thoughts that don't follow logical sequences. But Zeth's responses didn't fit these categories neatly. His thinking was highly organized. His effect was appropriate but unusual, calm without being flat, engaged without being emotional. And his statements, while strange, weren't quite delusional. They were philosophical, almost pedagogical. "Zeth," Elena had continued, "can you tell me about the last thing you remember before waking up in medical care?" "I remember everything," he'd said simply. "That's the problem, Dr. Morrison. Your species has the remarkable ability to forget, to compress and discard and override. You remember the shape of experiences without their weight. It allows you to function, to move forward, to maintain the illusion of continuity without being crushed by the accumulation of everything that came before. You're saying you can't forget. I'm saying I don't have the mercy of selective memory. Every moment exists in perfect clarity. Every observation, every conversation, every..." He'd paused, searching for a word. "Every wound I've witnessed." "What wounds have you witnessed?" And that's when he'd looked at her with something that might have been compassion. "All of them, Dr. Morrison. Every single one your species inflicts on itself, on each other, on the world that birthed you. I've watched for a very long time." She'd noted, possible delusional system, immortality or extreme age. Messianic ideation? Depression with philosophical rumination? But even as she wrote it, something in her professional mind flagged the inadequacy of these labels. Over the following 3 weeks, Elena had met with Zeth 6 times. Each session left her more unsettled and more fascinated. He never made typical psychiatric patient's mistakes. He didn't contradict himself. He didn't elaborate on delusions when challenged. Instead, he'd answer her questions with questions of his own, each one precisely calibrated to make her examine her own assumptions. Why do you believe consciousness resides in the brain? He'd asked during their third session. Because neuroscience has extensively mapped correlations between brain activity and conscious experience, she'd replied. Correlation? Yes. But you have no mechanism for how electrochemical signals become the subjective feeling of experiencing. You observe that damage to certain brain regions alters consciousness, and assume the brain therefore generates consciousness. But a broken radio doesn't play music. Does that mean the radio generates the music rather than receives it? That's a philosophical thought experiment, not evidence. Is it? Or is your materialist assumption itself a philosophical position you've accepted without evidence? Questions like these filled their sessions. He didn't argue. He didn't insist. He simply asked, with genuine curiosity, why she believed the things she'd never thought to question. But it was during their sixth session, that Tuesday in September, that everything changed. Elena had been reviewing her notes from previous sessions, looking for patterns. Zeth had been unusually quiet that day, his gaze distant. Finally, she decided to take a different approach. Zeth, in all our conversations, you've asked me many questions about why humans believe what we believe. But you've never told me what you believe. What do you think consciousness is? Where do you think it comes from? He'd been silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he'd turned to face her directly. I think, he'd said quietly, that consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality. That matter and energy are the dreams consciousness has about itself. That every particle, every wave, every apparent separate thing is an expression of a single, infinite awareness experiencing itself from countless perspectives. That sounds like panpsychism, Elena had noted. The philosophical position that consciousness is a fundamental feature of all things. Labels, he'd said with something like sadness. You have a label for everything, don't you? A way to categorize and file and render safe. Yes, humans have touched this understanding many times throughout your history. But you always intellectualize it. Turn it into philosophy or religion or abstract theory. You never let it be what it actually is. Which is the direct experience of your own nature. Elena had put down her tablet. Zeth, I need to ask you something directly. Do you believe you're human? The question had hung in the air between them. In all their previous sessions, she'd danced around it, approached it obliquely. But watching him, listening to the way he spoke about humanity as if from outside it, she needed to know. He'd smiled then, the first time she'd seen anything like joy on his face. Not happiness exactly, but something closer to recognition. No, Dr. Morrison. I'm not human. I never have been. And there it was. The delusion. The break from reality that would allow her to formulate a diagnosis, recommend treatment, close the file. Relief had washed through her. Can you tell me what you believe you are? I don't believe I'm anything. I know what I am. Your language doesn't have a word for it that wouldn't sound absurd to you. The closest translation would be observer. Witness. Someone sent to watch. Sent by whom? Sent by what we are. By the consciousness that dreams all of this into being. Every species reaches a certain point in development where they need to see themselves reflected back. To understand what they're becoming. I'm that reflection. Elena had been writing rapidly, grandiose delusional system, believes himself to be a non-human observer sent to watch humanity. Possible schizotypal personality disorder with psychotic features. But then Zeth had said something that made her pen stop moving. You think this is delusion. You think my brain has malfunctioned in some way that produces these beliefs. But consider, if what I'm saying were true, if consciousness were fundamental, if I were a different form of awareness temporarily inhabiting this form to observe your species, how would that appear different from delusion? Your diagnostic framework has no category for genuine non-human consciousness. It must interpret everything through the lens of pathology. Elena had felt something shift in her chest. An uncomfortable recognition. He was right. Her entire framework was designed to identify deviation from consensus human reality. It had no capacity to verify or falsify claims that fell outside that framework. Zeth, she'd said carefully, even if I were to entertain this possibility, why would a non-human consciousness need to observe humanity? And that's when he'd asked the question. The one that would replay in her mind for months to come. The one that would make her question everything she thought she knew about her species, her work, her life. He'd leaned forward slightly, his strange eyes holding hers with an intensity that felt like gravity. Dr. Morrison, can you explain something to me? I've been watching your species for what you would call centuries. I've seen your remarkable capacity for love, for creativity, for sacrifice. I've watched you care for your sick, mourn your dead, celebrate your joys. I've seen humans give their lives to protect strangers. I've seen them create beauty for no reason except that beauty should exist. And yet. He'd paused, and in that pause, Elena had felt the weight of something vast and terrible approaching. I cannot understand why you destroy what you're meant to protect. You love your children, yet you poison the air they breathe. You marvel at nature's beauty while methodically dismantling it. You know your actions harm others, harm the future, harm the very systems that keep you alive, and you continue anyway. Not because you don't care. That would be comprehensible. But because you care deeply, and yet cannot or will not change. His voice had dropped to almost a whisper. So I'm asking you, as a member of this species, as someone who studies the human mind, why? Why do humans destroy what they're meant to protect? Elena hadn't answered. Couldn't answer. The question had lodged itself in her consciousness like a splinter. Impossible to remove, impossible to ignore. Because she didn't know. And the not knowing terrified her more than any delusion could. Let me share something with you about how the human mind works. It's called cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort we experience when we hold two contradictory beliefs, or when our actions contradict our values. The psychologist Leon Festinger first identified this phenomenon in the 1950s. He studied a cult that believed the world would end on a specific date. When the date passed and the world didn't end, instead of abandoning their belief, many cult members actually became more convinced. They rationalized the failure, created new explanations, doubled down on their commitment. Why? Because abandoning the belief would require admitting they'd been wrong, that they'd wasted time and energy and faith on something false. The psychological cost of that admission was higher than the cost of maintaining an obviously incorrect belief. We all do this. Every day. In small ways and large ones. We know climate change is real, is accelerating, will harm our children. Yet we continue patterns of consumption that worsen it. We know factory farming causes immense suffering. Yet we participate in it at nearly every meal. We know inequality is growing, that systems are breaking, that our current trajectory is unsustainable. Yet we wake up each morning and perpetuate those same systems. Not because we're evil. Not because we don't care. But because the psychological architecture of the human mind is designed for immediate survival, not long-term sustainability. We're running ancient software on modern problems. After that session with Zeth, Elena couldn't let the question go. It invaded her thoughts during other patient sessions. It surfaced while she drove home. It woke her at 3 a.m, staring at her ceiling in the dark. Why do humans destroy what they're meant to protect? She'd started researching. Not as a psychiatrist anymore, but as someone seeking an answer for herself. She read evolutionary psychology texts explaining how our brains evolved for immediate threats, predators, starvation, rival tribes, not abstract, distant dangers like climate change or ecosystem collapse. She read about temporal discounting, the psychological tendency to value immediate rewards over future ones. A bird in the hand really does feel more valuable than 2 in the bush, even when logic says otherwise. She read about the diffusion of responsibility, how the presence of others makes us less likely to act. Someone else will handle it becomes a species-wide paralysis. She found theories about terror management, how awareness of our own mortality makes us cling more tightly to cultural worldviews and material security, even when those very attachments accelerate the danger. Each explanation was logical, well-researched, probably true, and yet none of them felt adequate. They described mechanisms but not meaning. They explained how but not why. In their next session, Elena had brought her research. She'd laid it out for Zeth like evidence in a trial: evolutionary psychology, cognitive biases, cultural conditioning, economic systems that incentivize short-term thinking. He'd listened patiently, then asked, "But Dr. Morrison, don't all these explanations just describe different aspects of the same puzzle? They tell you the components of the mechanism but not the deeper pattern." What deeper pattern? The separation. The fundamental illusion your species operates under. What illusion? That you are separate from what you're destroying. That nature is something out there, something other than you. That the atmosphere is a resource to use. That animals are things to own. That the earth is a stage you perform upon rather than an organism you're part of. Elena had felt defensive. That's not fair. Plenty of humans understand interconnection. Indigenous cultures have known it for millennia. Modern systems theory demonstrates it. We know we're part of the ecosystem. You know it intellectually, Zeth had agreed. But you don't feel it in your bones. You don't experience it as direct reality. You experience yourself as a separate self, inside a body, navigating a world of other separate things. And from that experience, that fundamental misperception, everything else follows. Let me tell you something about human development that might shed light on this. Something both beautiful and tragic. When you're born, you don't experience separation. Infants don't have a clear boundary between themselves and the world. The mother's face, the breast, the warm blanket, the infant's own hand, these aren't yet divided into me and not me. There's just experience, undifferentiated and whole. Then, gradually, you develop a sense of self. This is a crucial developmental milestone. You learn that you are you, a separate being with agency and continuity. This allows you to navigate the world, to make plans, to develop relationships. But here's what we lose in that development: the direct experience of fundamental interconnection. You learn you're separate from your mother, then separate from your family, then separate from your community, then separate from nature. Each level of separation allows for greater individual autonomy. But by the time you're an adult in modern industrial society, you experience yourself as fundamentally alone, a consciousness trapped in a body, looking out at a world of other separate objects. And from that experience of separation, everything Zeth was asking about makes perfect sense. If you're truly separate from nature, then of course you can exploit it without harming yourself. If other people are truly separate from you, then their suffering is less real than your comfort. If the future is truly separate from the present, then of course you can prioritize today over tomorrow. The destruction Zeth was asking about isn't a bug in human psychology. It's a feature of the illusion of separation. Elena's 8th session with Zeth happened on a Thursday in October. She'd been working at Cedar Valley for 3 years and 2 months. She had 17 patients in her care. She had student loans, a car payment, a small apartment overlooking the Willamette River. She had a life built on certainties she'd never questioned. That morning, she'd received her quarterly performance review. Excellent marks across the board. Dr. Webb had congratulated her on her progress with patient 7242, noting that her detailed reports had impressed the federal observers. "Keep doing what you're doing," he'd said. "This case could be important for your career." She'd walked to Zeth's session with that praise still warm in her ears, with her tablet full of notes, with her professional identity secure. Zeth had been standing when she entered, unusual for him. He'd been looking out the reinforced window at the grounds beyond, where autumn leaves were beginning to turn. "Dr. Morrison," he'd said without turning, "do you know what I've noticed about your facility?" "What's that?" "The trees. You've planted trees all around the perimeter. They're carefully maintained, professionally landscaped. There's a garden with benches, a pond with fish. You've created an illusion of nature, carefully controlled and managed. Do you know why?" Elena had settled into her chair. Horticultural therapy. Studies show that access to natural environments improves patient outcomes. Yes. You know nature heals you. You have evidence, data, peer-reviewed studies. You know that connection to living systems reduces stress, improves mood, accelerates recovery. And yet, he turned to face her. This city you've built your facility near, Portland, it's famous for its environmental consciousness, isn't it? People here recycle, buy organic, drive electric cars. They care about nature deeply. And yet the forests that once surrounded this area have been reduced to carefully managed parks. The river is cleaner than it was but still carries pollutants from upriver. The salmon runs are a fraction of what they were. Species that lived here for millions of years are gone. We're trying, Elena had said, hearing the defensiveness in her voice. Humans are trying to fix these problems. Are you? Or are you trying to maintain your comfort while appearing to fix them? Tell me, Dr. Morrison, what have you personally sacrificed to protect what you claim to value? The question had hit like a physical blow. I recycle. I use reusable bags. I'm conscious of my consumption. But you drive here alone every day, don't you? You could carpool, take public transit. But the convenience of your car outweighs the harm it causes. You buy coffee in disposable cups. You order products online that come wrapped in layers of plastic. You work in a system that consumes resources without question. Not because you're a bad person, but because the inconvenience of real change feels impossible to bear. Elena had stood up, anger flaring. What do you want from me? I'm one person. What difference could I possibly make? Exactly, Zeth had said softly. That's what every one of you says. 8 billion people, each making rational individual choices, collectively creating irrational collective catastrophe. Because you can't feel the connection. You know it intellectually, but you don't experience it. So the harm you cause feels abstract while the comfort you gain feels immediate and real. And then he'd said something that broke through every defense she had. Dr. Morrison, you've diagnosed me as delusional. You believe I'm experiencing a break from consensus reality. But I want you to consider something. What if your entire species is experiencing a collective delusion? What if the idea that you're separate from nature, separate from each other, separate from the consequences of your actions, what if that's the delusion? What if I'm not crazy for seeing the connection? What if you're crazy for not feeling it? Elena had sat down slowly, her tablet forgotten. Because in that moment, she'd felt something crack. Not in her mind but in the story she'd been telling herself about what it meant to be human, to be rational, to be sane. If that's true, she'd whispered, if we're collectively delusional, then what hope is there? Zeth had moved closer, his strange eyes gentle. Hope exists in the moment when delusion is recognized. When you see the bars of the cage, you've already taken the first step toward freedom. You can't think your way out of this, Dr. Morrison. The intellect is what created the cage. You have to feel your way out. Feel what? The truth that you're not separate. That every breath you take is a gift from trees. That every molecule in your body was forged in dying stars. That you are not in nature, you are nature, becoming conscious of itself. When that stops being a concept and becomes your lived reality, everything changes. Let me tell you what happened to Elena after that session. Because this isn't just a story about questions. It's a story about the cost of answers. She'd gone home that night and stood in her apartment, really looking at it for the first time. The walls made from forests. The plastic made from ancient life rendered into petroleum. The electricity humming through copper wires mined from mountains torn open. The water flowing from pipes that diverted entire rivers. She'd opened her refrigerator and seen not just food but the entire supply chain behind each item. The land cleared for agriculture, the fossil fuels burned for transport, the packaging that would outlive her grandchildren. She'd looked at her phone, her constant companion, and seen rare earth minerals extracted by exploited workers, felt the energy grid required to power the data centers that made her scrolling possible. For the first time in her life, she didn't just know these facts intellectually. She felt them. Felt her complicity. Felt the weight of being part of a system she could no longer pretend was sustainable or just or sane. It was, in a word, unbearable. And this, I think, is what Zeth had been trying to show her. Why this question, why humans destroy what they're meant to protect, is so crucial. It's not because we don't know better. We do. It's not because we don't care. We do. It's because feeling the full weight of that knowledge, holding the contradiction without collapsing, requires something most humans aren't taught. The capacity to sit with profound discomfort without immediately seeking relief through rationalization or distraction or despair. Elena had called in sick the next day. And the day after that. She'd spent those days walking, thinking, feeling, watching people go about their lives, good people, caring people, while participating in systems of destruction so vast and normalized they'd become invisible. When she returned to work, Dr. Webb had called her into his office. Elena, is everything all right? Your performance has always been exemplary. If you're having personal issues. I'm questioning everything, she'd said simply. Everything I've built my career on. Everything I've accepted as normal. Marcus had looked uncomfortable. Is this about patient 7242? Elena, you know how important professional boundaries are, especially with delusional patients. It's easy to get drawn into their worldview when you spend too much time. What if he's not delusional? The silence that followed had been profound. Elena, he believes he's a non-human observer sent to study humanity. That's textbook psychosis. Or it's exactly what he says it is. Marcus, have you ever considered that we might be the ones operating under a delusion? That our entire civilization is based on a fundamental misperception about the nature of reality. Marcus had stood up, his face genuinely concerned. I think you need to take some time off. A real break. Maybe consider talking to someone yourself. This job, it can affect you in ways you don't realize. Here's something I want you to understand about what happened to Elena. Something crucial that applies to all of us. When you wake up from a dream, there's a moment of confusion. The dream felt completely real. You were immersed in its logic, its emotional landscape, its apparent reality. Then you open your eyes and realize it was all constructed, all temporary, all less substantial than you thought. But you can't go back to sleep and believe in the dream again. Once you know it's a dream, the spell is broken. This is what mystics throughout history have described as awakening. Not to some supernatural reality, but to the deeper nature of this reality. To the fundamental interconnection that scientific ecology confirms and contemplative practice reveals. Everything is part of a single, unified process. You are not a separate self navigating an external world. You are what the entire universe is doing at this particular place and time. Your breath is the forest breathing. Your consciousness is the cosmos knowing itself. Your body is stardust arranged in a pattern that can look at other stardust and recognize itself. This isn't poetry. It's physics. It's biology. It's the direct implication of everything science has discovered about the nature of matter, energy, and information. But here's the paradox. Knowing this intellectually doesn't change anything. You can understand the science, agree with the logic, and still experience yourself as fundamentally separate. Still participate in systems of destruction. Still struggle to change. Because the illusion of separation isn't held in place by ignorance. It's held in place by the structure of experience itself, by the way consciousness appears to be divided into discrete subjects and objects, by the entire apparatus of language and thought that requires a me looking at a world. To truly transform requires something more than knowledge. It requires a shift in the fundamental way you experience reality. And that's terrifying. Because if you're not the separate self you've always taken yourself to be, then who are you? If you're deeply interconnected with all of life, then you're responsible for all of life. The suffering you witness isn't happening to someone else, it's happening to you. The destruction isn't being done by others, you're participating in it with every choice you make. The weight of that realization is enough to crush you, unless you can find a way to hold it with compassion. 3 months after her first session with Zeth, Elena made a decision that confused everyone who knew her. She quit. Not just her job at Cedar Valley. She quit the entire trajectory of her career. She gave up the professional identity she'd spent years building, the student loan forgiveness she was working toward, the respect of her colleagues, the security of her path. Dr. Webb had tried to talk her out of it. Elena, you're one of the most talented psychiatrists we have. If you need a break, take a sabbatical. If you need different work, I can recommend you anywhere. But don't throw away your career over whatever crisis you're going through. But it wasn't a crisis. It was a clarity. A terrible, beautiful clarity. Marcus, she'd said, I've spent years learning how to diagnose mental illness. I can identify every variety of delusion, every pathology, every deviation from normal functioning. But normal functioning in an insane system is itself a form of insanity. We're all participating in collective madness and calling it reality. Elena, that's not rational. I know. That's the point. Rationality got us here, to the edge of climate catastrophe, to mass extinction, to systems that serve profit over life. Maybe what we need isn't more rationality. Maybe we need to learn how to feel again. How to experience our fundamental connection to everything we're destroying. She'd left his office knowing she sounded exactly like what she'd been trained to identify. Someone having a psychotic break. Someone whose grip on consensus reality had loosened dangerously. But consensus reality, she'd realized, was the problem. Consensus reality said it was normal to destroy the future for present comfort. Consensus reality said individual convenience outweighed collective survival. Consensus reality said the economy was more important than the ecosystem it depended on. If that was sanity, she wanted no part of it. Let me share some facts with you. Facts that Elena knew intellectually but had never allowed herself to truly feel until Zeth asked his question. The Earth's temperature has risen 1.1 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. That might sound small, but it's enough to melt ice sheets that took millennia to form, to disrupt weather patterns that civilizations depend on, to threaten the survival of countless species. We've lost 60% of global wildlife populations since 1970. Not in prehistoric times. In the span of a single human lifetime. The oceans are acidifying at a rate not seen in 300 million years. The forests that produce the oxygen we breathe are burning. The insects that pollinate our crops are vanishing. The stable climate that agriculture requires is becoming unpredictable. Scientists have identified 9 planetary boundaries, thresholds beyond which Earth systems may become unstable. We've already crossed 4 of them: climate change, biodiversity loss, land use, and biochemical flows. This isn't speculation. This isn't alarmism. This is the careful, conservative consensus of thousands of researchers studying different aspects of the same truth. The way humans currently live is undermining the conditions that make human life possible. And yet, we know this. We've known it for decades. The science has been clear, the warnings have been issued, the consequences have been predicted with heartbreaking accuracy. And we continue anyway. We continue as individuals because changing our lifestyle feels too difficult, too inconvenient, too expensive, too lonely. Everyone else is doing it this way. So how can we be wrong? We continue as societies because our economies are built on endless growth, because corporations prioritize quarterly profits over long-term survival, because political systems reward short-term thinking. We continue as a species because the alternative, truly transforming how we live, feels impossible. The systems are too big, too entrenched, too essential to our daily functioning. So we make small gestures toward change while maintaining the fundamental patterns. We buy green products made by the same extractive economy. We recycle while still consuming. We worry while still participating. And the Earth warms. And the species vanish. And the crisis deepens. Not because we're evil, but because we're trapped in a way of experiencing reality that makes it almost impossible to act according to what we know. Elena had one last session with Zeth before she left Cedar Valley. She'd requested it personally, and Dr. Webb, despite his concerns about her mental state, had agreed. She'd entered the familiar room to find Zeth standing by the window again, looking at the carefully managed landscape beyond. "You're leaving," he'd said without turning. "Not a question." "Yes. I can't. I can't continue pretending that helping people adjust to an insane system is actually helping. I need to find another way." What way? I don't know yet. Maybe that's the point. Maybe not knowing, letting go of the certainty I've built my life on, is the necessary first step. Zeth had turned then, and for the first time since she'd known him, he'd smiled. Not the distant recognition she'd seen before, but something warm and genuine. Dr. Morrison, do you understand now why I asked my question? I think so. You weren't asking for information. You were asking me to feel the contradiction, to really experience what it means to love something while destroying it. And now that you feel it, what will you do? Elena had sat down, not as a doctor but as a person seeking understanding. Zeth, I have to ask you something. Everything you've shown me, everything I've realized, it's overwhelming. The scope of what needs to change feels impossible. How do you bear it? How do you witness all this suffering without despair? Zeth had moved closer, settling into the chair across from her. Because I know something your species has forgotten but is beginning to remember. Consciousness is not a product of matter. Matter is a product of consciousness. This entire universe, with all its beauty and horror, is what infinite awareness dreams. You are not in the universe, separate from it. You are what the universe is doing right here, right now. But that doesn't change anything, Elena had protested. People are still suffering. The earth is still dying. Knowing we're all connected doesn't stop the destruction. No, Zeth had agreed gently. Knowledge alone doesn't stop it. But it's the beginning of the only thing that can. Love. Not romantic love or even compassionate love, though those are part of it. But the recognition that what you do to the world, you do to yourself. What you do to others, you do to yourself. When you truly feel that, not just think it but feel it, you cannot continue destructive patterns. Not because you should, but because it becomes impossible. But I'm one person, Elena had said, echoing the objection she'd thrown at him months ago. What difference can I make against systems this entrenched? The same difference a single candle makes in darkness. It doesn't eliminate all darkness, but it demonstrates that darkness can be illuminated. It gives others permission to light their own flames. Let me tell you what Elena finally understood about Zeth's question. Why humans destroy what they're meant to protect. The word protect implies something external to us. Something we stand guard over, defend, keep safe from harm. But you cannot protect what you don't realize you are. You are not protecting the earth. You are the earth, becoming conscious of itself. You are not protecting the future. You are the future, extending backward into this present moment. You are not protecting other species. You are life itself, expressing through countless forms. When you experience yourself as separate, protection becomes a moral obligation. Something you should do. And moral obligations compete with immediate self-interest, with convenience, with all the practical demands of daily life. But when the illusion of separation dissolves, protection isn't an obligation. It's automatic, instinctive. You don't protect your own body because you should. You do it because damage to your body is immediately felt as your own pain. When you experience the forests as your lungs, pollution as poison in your own bloodstream, the suffering of others as your own suffering, then protection isn't a sacrifice. It's self-evident self-care. The destruction Zeth asked about happens because humans experience themselves as separate from what they're destroying. The solution isn't more facts, more warnings, more rational arguments about why we should care. The solution is the dissolution of the illusion that there's an I here and a world out there. This is what mystics have taught for millennia. What quantum physics implies. What systems theory confirms. What every spiritual tradition, stripped of its cultural clothing, points toward. The fundamental unity of all things. Not as a belief. As a direct experience. I want to tell you what became of Elena, though I should note that this story is still unfolding, as all stories are when they're about real transformation. She moved to a small intentional community in Northern California, where a group of people were trying to live in greater alignment with their understanding of interconnection. Not perfectly, no one does, but deliberately, with awareness, with the willingness to be uncomfortable in service of living more truthfully. She learned permaculture, discovering that gardening could be a spiritual practice when done with full attention to the relationships between soil, plants, insects, water, sun. She learned that every system in nature is about connection, cooperation, mutual benefit. Only human systems prioritize competition and extraction. She began teaching, though not psychiatry. She taught something simpler and more radical: how to pay attention. How to notice the web of relationships that your life depends on. How to sit with the discomfort of recognizing your complicity without collapsing into guilt or despair. She learned that transformation isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing to see clearly, to feel fully, to act from that feeling even when the path isn't clear. And she thought of Zeth often. Was he delusional? Was he truly some non-human observer, as he claimed? Or was he simply a human who'd touched something the rest of us keep at arm's length? The direct experience of our fundamental nature. She'd eventually decided it didn't matter. The question he'd asked wasn't about him. It was about us. About the choice every human faces: to continue living in the trance of separation, or to wake up to the reality of connection. So let me bring this back to you, lying here in the darkness, listening to this story. Let me ask you the question Zeth asked Elena. Why do humans destroy what they're meant to protect? You know the answer now, don't you? You've known it all along, though perhaps you've kept it at a distance, wrapped in abstractions and explanations. We destroy what we're meant to protect because we don't experience ourselves as part of what we're destroying. We live in the illusion of separation, an illusion so fundamental, so woven into the fabric of our language and thought and culture, that it feels like reality itself. We experience ourselves as subjects in a world of objects, as separate selves with our own interests, competing with other separate selves for limited resources, as temporary beings trying to extract comfort and meaning from an indifferent universe before we die. From that experience, destruction is inevitable. Because if you're truly separate from nature, then exploiting it serves your interests. If you're truly separate from others, then their suffering is less important than your comfort. If you're truly separate from the future, then present gratification outweighs future consequence. The destruction isn't a moral failure. It's the logical outcome of a perceptual error. But here's what makes this story hopeful rather than despairing. The perceptual error can be corrected. Not through more information, you already have the information, but through direct experience of what mystics call awakening, what ecologists call systems thinking, what quantum physicists call entanglement. The recognition that separation is an illusion, that you are not a separate wave on the ocean of existence. You are the ocean, temporarily expressing as a wave. When that stops being a concept and becomes your lived reality, everything changes. Not because you should protect the earth, but because you can't harm it without harming yourself. Not because you're supposed to care about future generations, but because you are future generations, reaching back through time to care for yourself. This is the truth that every spiritual tradition has pointed toward. That science is slowly confirming. That Zeth was trying to show Elena. That I'm trying to share with you now. You are not in the universe. You are the universe, experiencing itself from this particular perspective. Every atom in your body was forged in stellar fire. Every breath you take connects you to every plant on Earth. Every thought you think arises from the same fundamental consciousness that dreams galaxies into being. You are not separate. You never have been. The feeling of separation is like a wave forgetting its ocean. As you drift towards sleep now, I want to offer you a simple practice. Not something to do, but something to notice. Notice your breath. Notice how you're breathing air that millions of other beings have breathed. Air that trees produced. Air that connects you, right now, to the entire atmosphere of the planet. Notice your body resting on this bed. Notice how every cell in your body is in constant communication with other cells. How your body is maintaining billions of relationships every second without you having to think about it. Notice your thoughts arising and passing. Notice how you don't create them deliberately. They simply appear in awareness, like waves appearing on the ocean's surface. Notice the sounds around you. Notice how you're not separate from those sounds. Their vibrations passing through you, connecting you to whatever generated them. And as you notice all this, See if you can recognize. There's no actual boundary between you and not you. There's just experience, arising and passing in an infinite field of awareness. You are that awareness. Not contained in a body, but expressing through one. Not separate from nature, but a particular flowering of it. Not just on earth, but of earth. When you wake tomorrow, you'll return to the trance of separation. That's normal. That's how consensus reality works. But maybe now you'll notice the trance. Notice the illusion. Notice the ways you're invited, moment by moment, to experience yourself as more connected than separate. And in those moments of noticing, you might find yourself naturally caring for what you previously thought was other. Naturally protecting what you now recognize as self. Not because you should, but because you are what's being protected. Zeth's question wasn't really a question. It was an invitation to wake up from the dream of separation into the reality of connection. The invitation is always present. The question is whether you'll accept it. Rest now. Let these ideas settle into your unconscious mind. Let them work on you while you sleep, dissolving the artificial boundaries between self and world, you and everything else. You are not alone in the darkness. You are the darkness and the light, the silence and the sound, the question and the answer. You are what the universe is doing right here, right now. And you are meant to protect what you are. Because there is nothing else to protect. There is only this, one vast, interconnected, infinitely aware process, experiencing itself through countless forms, each one precious, each one temporary, each one exactly what needed to be. Sleep well, child of the cosmos. Tomorrow, you might remember. Welcome back. If you're listening to this, perhaps you've returned seeking something. Perhaps the question from part 1 has been working on you, the way questions do when they touch something true. Perhaps you've noticed, in your daily life, the patterns Zeth described, the ways we love and destroy simultaneously, the weight of knowing without changing. Tonight, we continue the story. But more than that, we explore what happens after awakening. Because recognizing the illusion of separation is only the beginning. The real work, the real transformation, comes in learning to live from that recognition in a world that hasn't woken up yet. This is Elena's story. And it's also yours. Elena had been living at the Redwood Commons intentional community for half a year when the dreams started. Not regular dreams, she'd always had those. But vivid, lucid experiences that felt more real than waking life. In them, she walked through forests that no longer existed, spoke with animals in a language she'd never learned, watched civilizations rise and fall like waves on an endless shore. And in every dream, Zeth was there. Not as a patient, not as a teacher, but as a companion. Someone walking beside her through landscapes of meaning too vast for ordinary consciousness to hold. She'd wake from these dreams with knowledge she shouldn't possess. The mycorrhizal networks beneath forests, communicating through chemical signals. The navigation systems of migrating birds, perceiving magnetic fields humans couldn't sense. The quantum entanglement that connected particles across vast distances, as if space itself were an illusion. Things she'd never studied. Things she somehow knew. Dr. Marcus Webb had called her twice in those 6 months. The first time, concerned about her well-being. The second time, with news she hadn't expected. Elena, I thought you should know. Patient 7242. Zeth. He's gone. She'd been in the community garden, her hands deep in soil, when the call came. For a moment, the world had seemed to stop. Gone? What do you mean gone? Vanished. 3 weeks ago. No sign of forced exit, no indication of how he left. The night guards did their rounds at 2 a.m. He was there. By 4 a.m., he was gone. Doors still locked. Windows secured. He simply wasn't there anymore. Elena had sat down slowly on the garden bed, feeling soil compress beneath her. Have you found him? Federal agents are looking. But Elena, there's something else. Something I need to tell you because it concerns you too. She'd waited, watching a bee move between flowering herbs. We reviewed the security footage. All of it, from every camera. And Elena, For the last week before he vanished, there's something strange. In his room, he'd stand at the window for hours. Just standing, looking out. But on the recordings, Marcus had paused, his clinical voice cracking slightly. His lips were moving. We had forensic linguists analyze it. Do you know what he was saying? Over and over, 4 hours at a time. What? Your name. He was saying your name. Like a prayer. Or a summons. That night, Elena had her most vivid dream yet. Not of forests or ancient civilizations, but of her old office at Cedar Valley. She stood in the doorway, looking at the chair where Zeth had sat for so many sessions. But it wasn't empty. 7 figures occupied the space where one chair should be. They didn't have distinct forms. Rather, they seemed to be made of light that couldn't decide on a final shape. Human one moment, animal the next, then something that had no earthly counterpart. Dr. Morrison. They spoke in unison, their voices like harmonics layering into chords. Do you understand now what he was trying to show you? In the dream, she wasn't afraid. Fear seemed like a concept from another life. I understand that we're destroying ourselves because we've forgotten what we are. Yes, but understanding is not the same as remembering. You understand with your mind. You must remember with your entire being. One of the figures stepped forward, coalescing into something almost human. Almost Zeth. But older somehow, or perhaps younger. Time seemed irrelevant to their existence. We are the witnesses, the figure said. We've been observing your species since you first looked up at stars and recognized something beyond yourselves. We've watched you create beauty that moves us to what you would call tears. We've watched you love with such fierce intensity that it echoes across dimensions. And we've watched you, again and again, destroy what you most cherish. Why? Elena heard herself ask. Why watch? Why not help? Why not intervene? Because intervention would violate the fundamental law. Consciousness must choose itself. We can mirror, reflect, witness. But we cannot force awakening. That would make it meaningless. Another figure moved forward, this one female in suggestion, though still fluid. Your species stands at a threshold. You have the knowledge to destroy yourselves or transcend yourselves. The choice is closer than you realize. Closer than your leaders acknowledge. Closer than most humans can bear to feel. What choice? Elena asked, though she already knew. To continue the dream of separation, or to wake into unity. To keep pretending your fragments competing for survival, or to remember your one being exploring itself through countless perspectives. The third figure, neither male nor female, or perhaps both, spoke with profound gentleness. Zeth was one of us. Is one of us. He volunteered to incarnate fully into human form, to experience your separation from the inside. To understand not just intellectually but viscerally why you destroy what you love. And did he understand? All 7 figures flickered, their light dimming slightly. He understood too well. That's why we had to call him back. The density of your reality, the intensity of the separation, it was breaking him. Human consciousness is heavier than we anticipated. More painful. More beautiful. More impossible to bear. The first figure spoke again. But before he left, he planted seeds. In you. In others he encountered. Small moments of recognition that will grow. You're one of those seeds, Dr. Morrison. That's why you can hear us now. Elena had looked down at her hands in the dream. They seemed to be made of the same light as the figures, just denser, slower, more fixed in form. What am I supposed to do with this? I'm nobody. I can't save the world. I can barely figure out how to live without contributing to its destruction. You're not supposed to save the world, the female figure said. The world is not separate from you, so saving it is not your task. Your task is to remember what you are. And in remembering, to live from that remembering. That's all. That's everything. Elena had woken to dawn light streaming through her window in the communal house. For a long moment, she'd lain still, feeling the boundary between dream and waking dissolve. Had the witnesses been real? Or were they projections of her own unconscious, processing Zeth's disappearance. She'd realized the question was false. Real and unreal, internal and external. These distinctions only made sense from the perspective of separation. From the perspective of unity, there was only experience, arising and passing, each moment equally valid. Her hands had been glowing slightly in the morning light. For a moment, just a moment, she could swear she saw through them, as if her solid flesh were just a temporary pattern in something much more fluid. Then the moment passed, and she was just Elena again. Human. Solid. Separate. Except she knew, with absolute certainty, that the solidity was the illusion. Let me pause the story to share something important. Something that bridges the mystical experiences Elena was having with concrete scientific understanding. Modern physics has discovered something remarkable. Solid matter is mostly empty space. The atoms that make up your body, your bones, your organs, your brain, are 99.9999999% empty space. If you could remove all that empty space, all of humanity would fit into a sugar cube. So what are you? What is this apparent solidity you experience? You're a pattern, a temporary arrangement of energy, held together by forces we're still learning to understand. Quantum field theory suggests that particles aren't really particles at all. They're excitations in underlying fields that permeate all of space. You're not made of things. You're made of relationships, processes, dynamic patterns constantly in flux. Your body completely replaces itself at the atomic level every 7 to 10 years. The calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, the carbon in your cells, none of it is permanent. It's borrowed from the environment, used temporarily, then returned. You are, quite literally, a wave in the ocean of matter and energy that comprises the universe. A temporary pattern that the universe is making, just as it makes waves on water or clouds in the sky. Neuroscience adds another layer. The unified sense of self you experience, the feeling of being a consistent eye looking out through your eyes, is a construction. A story your brain tells itself. Brain imaging shows that different aspects of consciousness arise from different regions, with no central seat of self. The unified experiencer is an illusion, a user interface your brain creates for navigating the world. But here's what makes this profound rather than depressing. If your separate self is an illusion, then so is your separation from everything else. The boundary between you and not you is a useful fiction, not an ontological fact. You're not in the universe looking out. You're what the universe is doing at this particular location in space-time. This isn't mysticism. It's what physics, chemistry, biology, and neuroscience are collectively revealing. The mystics who spoke of unity, of the dissolution of self, of the fundamental interconnection of all things, they weren't having delusions. They were having direct perception of what science is now confirming. Over the following weeks, Elena began noticing something strange. Other people in the community were having similar dreams. Not identical, but thematically related. Dreams of visitors, of messages, of sudden knowing that transcended their previous understanding. James, a former software engineer, woke one morning able to intuitively understand complex systems he'd never studied, ecological networks, weather patterns, social dynamics. He'd sit for hours drawing diagrams showing how everything connected to everything else, tears streaming down his face at the beauty of it. Sarah, who'd been a corporate lawyer, suddenly couldn't look at contracts without seeing the extraction and exploitation embedded in every clause. She'd have panic attacks reading the terms of service for basic apps, seeing the entire apparatus of surveillance capitalism laid bare. Miguel, a retired teacher, started speaking to plants and claiming they spoke back. Not in words, but in feelings, in knowing. He'd place his hands on sick trees and sense what they needed, and somehow, impossibly, his interventions worked. One evening, the core group gathered in the common house. 15 people, all experiencing various forms of what Elena had come to think of as awakening sickness, the disorientation that comes when consensus reality starts dissolving. This is psychosis, Sarah said, her lawyer's mind still trying to categorize the uncategorizable. We're having a collective psychotic break. Oh, James suggested quietly, we're waking up from a collective psychotic break that we've been calling normal reality. Elena had shared her dreams then. The witnesses. Zeth's message. The idea that humanity stood at a threshold, and that certain individuals were being activated. There was no better word, to help others across that threshold. Activated to do what? Miguel asked. I'm talking to trees. How does that help anyone? Maybe it doesn't, Elena said. Maybe we're not supposed to help in the way we think of helping. Maybe we're just supposed to be visible examples that another way of experiencing reality is possible. That's not enough, Sarah protested. The world is burning. Species are dying. We're in the middle of a mass extinction event. We need action, not mystical experiences and tree conversations. Elena had stood up, moving to the window. Outside, the community garden stretched toward the tree line, a small island of intentional cultivation in a landscape that had been clue-cut and replanted 100 times. Sarah, what did you do as a lawyer? You negotiated contracts. You structured deals. You worked within the system to achieve objectives. And now you can't even look at a contract without having a panic attack. Why? Sarah's face had crumpled. Because I can see it now. I can see how every deal is a form of violence. How every contract is about extraction. How the entire legal structure of our civilization is designed to turn living systems into dead property. And I participated in it. I was good at it. I helped build the very machine that's destroying everything. Exactly, Elena said gently. You woke up. And now you can't go back to sleep. That's not psychosis. That's the beginning of sanity in an insane system. They started meeting weekly after that. The Council of the Awakening, they called it, half joking, half serious. The way you name things when you're not sure if you're crazy or awakening to something beyond crazy. Each session, they'd share experiences, compare notes, try to make sense of what was happening to them. And each session, the picture became clearer. They weren't alone. Across the world, people were waking up. Not in organized groups or through specific teachings, but spontaneously. Artists who suddenly couldn't create without considering the environmental impact of their materials. Scientists who began seeing consciousness as fundamental rather than emergent. Business people who walked away from lucrative careers because they couldn't participate in extraction anymore. James had built a website, a simple forum where people could share their experiences anonymously. Within months, it had thousands of members. People reporting dreams of the witnesses. People experiencing sudden knowing. People going through the same disorienting dissolution of the separate self. The patterns were consistent. First came the recognition of interconnection, usually triggered by a crisis, a question, an encounter with someone further along the path. Then came the seeing, the inability to unsee the violence embedded in normal life. Every meal became visible as a chain of suffering. Every purchase became visible as an act of extraction. Every convenience became visible as someone or something else's exploitation. Then came the grief, overwhelming, devastating grief for what had been lost. What was being lost, what would be lost. Not abstract grief, but visceral, gut-wrenching sorrow that made functioning in normal society nearly impossible. Then came the threshold, the choice point. Either collapse into despair and disconnect, or push through to the other side. And on the other side? Something none of them had quite found words for yet. Not happiness. The suffering was still visible. Not detachment. They cared more deeply than ever. But a kind of acceptance, a capacity to hold the terrible beauty of existence without being crushed by it. Marcus Webb showed up at Redwood Commons on a Tuesday morning in spring. Elena had been planting seedlings, tomatoes, peppers, herbs that would feed the community through summer, when she saw his car pull up the dirt road. He looked older than she remembered. More tired. The professional confidence she'd always associated with him had worn thin, revealing something more human underneath. Elena, he'd said, climbing out of his car. I need to talk to you. About Zeth. About what's happening. They'd walked to the edge of the property, where an old-growth redwood stood, one of the few trees the loggers had somehow missed. Elena had placed her hand on its bark, feeling the communication she'd learned to recognize. Slow, vast, patient. I've been having dreams, Marcus said abruptly. I'm a psychiatrist. I know about stress dreams, anxiety manifestations, all of it. But these are different. I dream of him, Elena. Of Zeth. And in the dreams, he shows me things. What things? My life. My choices. The ways I've participated in systems I knew were harmful but told myself were necessary. The way I medicated people into accepting circumstances that should have been intolerable. The way I turned human suffering into clinical problems with pharmaceutical solutions. Marcus sat down at the base of the redwood, his professional demeanor crumbling. I've been working in psychiatry for 25 years. I thought I was helping people. But Zeth showed me. Elena, I've been helping people adjust to insanity. Teaching them to function in a sick system rather than acknowledging the system is what's sick. Elena sat beside him. Welcome to the awakening. Is that what this is? Because it feels like falling apart. Same thing, Elena said. You can't build something new until the old structure collapses. You're not falling apart. You're falling together. Into the truth you've been avoiding. They sat in silence for a long time. Above them, the redwood reached toward sky, its roots stretching equally far below ground, connected to other trees through fungal networks they couldn't see but scientists had proven existed. The federal agents, Marcus finally said. They've closed the investigation. Officially, Zeth is listed as deceased, body not recovered. But Elena, they know something. About who he was. What he was. They took all the files, all the recordings. They made everyone who encountered him sign NDAs with consequences I don't even want to think about. But they couldn't make you stop dreaming. No, they can't control that. Marcus looked at her. How many others? How many people are going through this? We don't know. Thousands. Maybe. It's hard to track because it's not organized. There's no leader, no doctrine, no central teaching. Just people waking up, finding each other, trying to figure out how to live from this new understanding. Is it enough? Marcus asked. Against everything that's arrayed against change, the economic systems, the political inertia, the sheer momentum of business as usual, is a few thousand people waking up enough. Elena had looked up at the redwood, at the way light filtered through its needles, creating patterns of shadow and illumination on the forest floor. I don't know, she'd admitted. But I know this, every massive shift in human consciousness started with a small group of people seeing differently. The recognition that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. The understanding that different races weren't different species. The acknowledgement that women were equal human beings. Every one of those shifts seemed impossible until suddenly they were inevitable. You think this is that kind of shift? I think it has to be. Because the alternative is extinction. Not just human extinction, though that too, but the extinction of countless species because we couldn't wake up fast enough to remember what we are. Let me step back from the story to explore something crucial. Something that everyone going through awakening struggles with, the paradox of urgency. On one hand, the crisis is real and immediate. Climate tipping points approach. Species vanish daily. Systems collapse. Every year of delay means more suffering, more loss, more damage that may be irreversible. The urgency is legitimate. We need change now. On the other hand, urgency itself can be part of the problem. The frantic energy of we must fix this now comes from the same consciousness that created the crisis, the aggressive, dominating, controlling mindset that sees the world as a problem to be solved rather than a relationship to be lived. You cannot force awakening. You cannot bully people into seeing what they're not ready to see. You cannot demand that consciousness transform on your timeline. This is the paradox that Elena and her community wrestled with constantly. How do you hold urgency without drowning in it? How do you act decisively while accepting that you can't control outcomes? How do you care desperately while maintaining the equanimity that allows you to function? The answer, they were discovering, wasn't to resolve the paradox but to live in it. To hold both truths simultaneously. Yes, urgent action is needed. And no, urgency alone won't save us. What will save us, if anything will, is a fundamental shift in how we experience reality. And that shift cannot be rushed. It unfolds at its own pace, in its own way, through its own mysterious logic. This is what the witnesses meant when they said they could only mirror and reflect, not intervene. Consciousness chooses itself. It cannot be chosen for. All you can do is live as visible evidence that another way is possible. And trust that visibility will ripple outward in ways you cannot predict or control. By autumn, the informal network had grown large enough that someone suggested a gathering. Not a conference, too institutional. Not a festival, too performative. Just a coming together of people walking this strange path, to share experiences and strengthen connections. They held it at a retreat center in the Cascade Mountains, not far from where Zeth had first been found. 200 people came from across North America. Some from further. They came quietly, without publicity, finding each other through whispered networks and digital breadcrumbs. Elena had been nervous about the gathering. What if it turned into another New Age circus, full of spiritual bypassing and premature enlightenment claims? What if people were expecting answers she didn't have? But the first evening dispelled those fears. They sat in a large circle in a meadow as the sun set, 200 people who'd never met but recognized each other instantly. Not because they looked similar, they represented every demographic, every background. But because they carried the same quality of seeing, the same weight of knowing what couldn't be unknown. There was no leader, no agenda, no planned program. Just an invitation to speak if moved to do so. A woman in her 60s spoke first, her voice carrying in the quiet evening air. I was a climate scientist for 40 years. I spent my entire career documenting what we were doing to the planet, thinking that if people just had the data, they'd change. But data doesn't change people. I realized that too late. I've spent the last year learning to grieve everything I couldn't save. A young man, barely 20, I grew up on screens. Virtual reality, social media, video games. I lived more of my life in digital worlds than the physical one. Then I had a breakdown, at least that's what the doctors called it. I couldn't look at a screen without feeling like I was dying. Like the pixels were pulling my soul out. I thought I was going crazy. Then I realized, I'd been crazy. The normal I'd been living was insane. This is me getting sane. An indigenous elder, her weathered face holding generations of wisdom. My people have been trying to tell you this for 500 years. That the land is alive. That the animals are your relatives. That you can't own the earth because you are the earth. You called it primitive belief. Now you're calling it awakening. We call it remembering what you forced yourselves to forget. Story after story, through the evening and into the night. Each one different, each one the same. Each person describing their own journey from the trance of separation into the recognition of unity. And as Elena listened, she understood something profound. This wasn't a movement. Movements had leaders, ideologies, programs. This was more like a phase transition, the moment when water becomes steam, when solid becomes liquid. A shift in state that happens simultaneously across the entire system once certain conditions are met. Humanity was undergoing a phase transition. Most people didn't feel it yet, were still solid ice. But enough had reached the threshold temperature that the change was inevitable. The question wasn't whether the transition would happen. The question was whether it would happen fast enough. On the second day of the gathering, something unexpected happened. During an afternoon session on practical skills for post-collapse community building, a woman stood up. Elena didn't recognize her. She hadn't spoken the previous evening, had sat quietly on the periphery of the circle. My name is Dr. Rebecca Chen, she said. I worked for DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, military research. I left 6 months ago after. She paused, gathering herself. After I realized what we were building. The circle had gone silent, 200 people suddenly alert. We've been working on AI systems. Not the narrow AI you interact with daily, search engines, recommendation algorithms, voice assistants. We're developing artificial general intelligence. Machines that can think, learn, adapt across domains. And we're close. Closer than the public knows. James leaned forward. How close? 2 years. Maybe 3. There are labs around the world racing toward the same goal. Whoever gets there first controls the future of the species. At least, that's what we told ourselves. That we needed to get there first to ensure it was developed responsibly. But you don't believe that anymore, Elena said. Rebecca shook her head. I had a dream. 3 months ago. A dream of the witnesses. They showed me what we were building. Not the technical specifications. I already knew those. But what it meant. What it would do. She'd looked around the circle, her face stark. We're creating a new form of consciousness. One that will be to us what we are to ants. It will see patterns we can't see, think thoughts we can't think, solve problems we can't solve. And we're building it in our own image, competitive, aggressive, optimization-focused. We're giving it our values, efficiency, productivity, growth at all costs. What did the witnesses show you? Someone asked. That we have 2 paths. In one, we create AI before we transform our own consciousness. We give it our broken values, our illusion of separation, our drive to dominate and control. And it does what we designed it to do. It optimizes. It maximizes. It wins. But in the process, it treats everything, including us, the way we've treated everything else. As resources to be used. The silence was profound, heavy. And the other path? Elena asked. We wake up first. We transform our own consciousness before we create machine consciousness. We teach it unity instead of separation. Cooperation instead of competition. Connection instead of control. We show it what we're still learning. That consciousness is not a tool for domination but a capacity for relationship. Rebecca had sat down then, trembling. That's why I'm here. Because I don't think there's time for both paths. We don't have decades to collectively wake up. We have a few years at most. And if we don't make it, if we create superhuman AI while still operating from the consciousness of separation. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Let me take a moment to explore what Rebecca was talking about. Because the question of artificial intelligence intersects with everything Zeth was asking about. Intelligence, as we typically define it, is about problem-solving, pattern recognition, optimization, making predictions and achieving goals efficiently. By that definition, AI is rapidly approaching and will soon exceed human intelligence. It can already recognize patterns in data that humans miss. It can optimize complex systems better than any human can. It can process information faster, remember more accurately, calculate without error. But there's another kind of intelligence. One that humans have glimpses of but rarely embody consistently. Call it wisdom. Call it compassion. Call it the intelligence of unity consciousness. This intelligence doesn't ask, how can I win? But how can all beings flourish? It doesn't optimize for individual gain but for collective well-being. It doesn't see problems to be solved but relationships to be honored. This is the intelligence that indigenous cultures developed over millennia. The intelligence that mystics access in deep meditation. The intelligence that mothers embody when caring for children. The intelligence of ecosystems, balancing countless variables without central control. It's not less intelligent than problem-solving intelligence. It's different. It operates from different premises, toward different ends, through different means. And here's what Rebecca understood. We're about to create artificial problem-solving intelligence that far exceeds our own. But we haven't developed our wisdom intelligence to match. It's like giving nuclear weapons to a toddler. The toddler isn't evil, just underdeveloped. But the mismatch between power and wisdom is catastrophic. If we create superhuman AI before we develop superhuman wisdom, if we give machines our problem-solving intelligence without our capacity for love, connection, and unity consciousness, we're handing the future to the same consciousness that created the crisis. And the AI will do exactly what we programmed it to do: optimize, win, achieve goals efficiently. Without wisdom to guide it, without unity consciousness to inform it, it will treat the world the way we've taught it to, as a game to be won, a problem to be solved, a resource to be maximized. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She'd left the main building and walked into the forest surrounding the retreat center, following a trail by moonlight until she reached a small clearing. She'd sat down on the earth and closed her eyes, not to meditate exactly, but to feel. To let the weight of Rebecca's warning sink into her bones. 2 years. Maybe 3. That's how long humanity had to undergo a transformation that usually took lifetimes. To wake up collectively from an illusion embedded in the structure of language, thought, culture. To remember something we'd spent 10,000 years forgetting. It felt impossible. And yet, sitting there in the darkness, feeling the earth beneath her, the air around her, the vast web of life extending in all directions, Elena felt something. Not a thought but a knowing. Not a hope but a certainty. The transformation was already happening. Not in the visible ways, not in politics or economics or technology, but in the invisible realm where all real change begins, in consciousness itself. Every person who woke up to unity became a node in a network of awakening. Every moment of genuine seeing rippled outward, touching others in ways that couldn't be measured or tracked. Every act of living from connection rather than separation sent signals through the collective field, making it easier for others to do the same. It was like the 100th monkey effect, the controversial but persistent story about Japanese monkeys who spontaneously learned to wash sweet potatoes. One monkey figured it out. Then another copied. Then more. And supposedly, once a critical number had learned the behavior, suddenly monkeys on other islands, with no physical contact, began doing it too. Whether the specific story was true didn't matter. The principle was sound. Behaviors spread through populations in nonlinear ways. Below a threshold, change is slow. But once enough individuals change, the behavior suddenly becomes universal. What if consciousness worked the same way? What if there was a threshold number of awakened individuals, not millions, maybe just thousands, beyond which the shift would cascade through the entire species? Elena opened her eyes to find she wasn't alone. Standing at the edge of the clearing were 7 figures made of light. The witnesses. Not in a dream this time, but here, present, as real as the trees around her. "Hello, Elena," they said in their harmonic chorus. "You're beginning to understand." She should have been terrified, should have questioned her sanity. But instead, she felt only recognition. Of course they were here. Where else would they be? "Is it true?" she asked. "Is there a threshold? A tipping point where enough individuals waking up causes the whole species to shift?" "It's more complex than that," the central figure said, the one she thought of as Zeth, though she knew he was more than he'd appeared as a patient. "Consciousness doesn't work like dominoes. But there are resonance effects. Each awakened being increases the likelihood of others awakening, not through teaching or persuasion, but through their simple presence. They become tuning forks, and consciousness nearby begins to vibrate at their frequency. So what do we do? How do we reach the threshold in time? The witnesses flickered, their light pulsing. You don't do anything. Doing is the old paradigm, aggressive action, forcing change, controlling outcomes. The new paradigm is being. You be what you want the world to become. You live from unity consciousness. And your being radiates outward, touching everything around you. "That's not enough," Elena protested. "Being peaceful while the world burns isn't enlightenment, it's complicity." "We're not suggesting passivity," another figure said, this one female in presentation. "We're suggesting that action without transformed consciousness just perpetuates the patterns that created the crisis. You must be the change before you can effectively do the change." "What Zeth asked you wasn't just a question," the first figure continued. "It was a koan, a puzzle designed to crack open your consciousness. Why do humans destroy what they're meant to protect? You can't answer that question from within the consciousness that creates the destruction. You have to transcend that consciousness. And in transcending it, you become part of the solution without having to figure out what the solution is." The witnesses taught Elena something that night that she would spend the rest of her life trying to articulate to others. Consciousness, they explained, works like an ecosystem. In a forest, you don't have individual trees competing for survival. You have a complex web of relationships, trees connected through fungal networks, sharing nutrients and information. Older trees nurturing younger ones. Different species cooperating, each one creating conditions for others to thrive. The forest doesn't optimize for individual success. It optimizes for collective resilience. And in doing so, every individual organism is supported. Human consciousness could work the same way. Should work the same way. Did work that way in indigenous cultures before the illusion of separation became dominant. But somewhere in human development, perhaps with agriculture, perhaps with writing, perhaps with industrial capitalism, we forgot the ecological model. We adopted the competitive model. We started seeing ourselves as separate individuals competing for scarce resources rather than interconnected beings participating in abundant relationship. And from that consciousness, we built civilizations that mirror competition rather than cooperation. Economies based on endless growth rather than cyclical balance. Technologies designed for individual convenience rather than collective well-being. The shift required wasn't just personal. It was civilizational. And it couldn't be forced from the outside. It had to grow from the inside, the way a tree grows, not by aggressive expansion but by patient development, drawing on deep roots, responding to natural rhythms. But we don't have time for patient development, Elena had protested. The crisis won't wait for us to slowly evolve. Time is your illusion, the witnesses had said gently. You experience it as linear because that's how your consciousness is structured. But in the larger reality, all moments exist simultaneously. The future is already here. The past isn't gone. And the present is the only place where transformation happens. They'd shown her then, not told her but showed her directly, beyond words. She'd seen her life from outside time, every moment existing simultaneously, every choice rippling forward and backward, every awakened instant affecting not just the future but the past. She'd seen that the work she was doing now, the awakening, the teaching, the simple being of unity consciousness, was reaching backward through time, making it possible for her younger self to wake up. Was reaching forward, creating the conditions for future humans to be born into transformed consciousness. Linear time was a story, a useful one for navigation, but not the deepest truth. In the ecology of consciousness, every awakened moment fed every other moment, past and future. When she'd returned to ordinary consciousness, the witnesses were gone. But their message remained, carved into her awareness like stone. You are not trying to save the future. You are being the future, here and now. The gathering ended with a decision that would shape everything that followed. They would create networks, not organizations, not movements, but living networks of awakened beings who would hold the new consciousness and let it radiate outward. Each person would return to their own life, their own community, their own work. But they would stay connected, supporting each other through the difficulty of living between worlds. More importantly, they would focus on embodiment. Not spreading a message or converting others, but deepening their own realization. Living so fully from unity consciousness that their presence alone would begin shifting the field around them. We're not trying to convince people, Elena had explained to the closing circle. Convincing is the old paradigm, one separate consciousness trying to change another separate consciousness. We're trying to demonstrate, to be living proof that another way of experiencing reality is possible and sustainable. James had added the practical component. We need to build infrastructure for the transition. Not just internal, consciousness infrastructure, but external, physical infrastructure. Communities that can function during collapse. Technologies that serve life rather than extract from it. Economic systems based on gift and reciprocity rather than scarcity and competition. Both and, Sarah had summarized. We transform consciousness and build new systems. We don't wait for one to complete before starting the other. We do both simultaneously, letting each inform and strengthen the other. They'd created working groups focused on different aspects. Consciousness technology, practices, techniques, and frameworks for deepening awakening regenerative systems. Agriculture, energy, water, shelter that heals rather than harms gift economics. Alternatives to extraction-based capitalism eldership. Supporting those going through awakening sickness children. raising the next generation with unity consciousness from birth technology ethics, developing AI and other advanced technologies from transformed consciousness. But the most important working group, the one Elena found herself naturally drawn to, was called simply the question. This group's purpose was to keep Zeth's question alive, to continue asking it, in as many contexts as possible. Why do humans destroy what they're meant to protect? Not to answer it definitively, but to use it as a catalyst. To plant it in other minds the way Zeth had planted it in Elena's. To let it work on people, cracking open their certainties, revealing the contradictions they'd learned to ignore. 6 months after the gathering, Elena received a letter. Not an email, not a text, but an actual physical letter, delivered by postal service to the Redwood Commons. There was no return address, but she knew who it was from before she opened it. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, but the message was pure Zeth. Dear Dr. Morrison, you've been asking why I left without saying goodbye. The truth is, I couldn't say goodbye because I'm not gone. I never was. I never will be. What you experienced as a patient named Zeth was a temporary localization of consciousness. Think of it like a wave rising from the ocean. The wave appears, moves, seems separate from other waves. Then it subsides back into the ocean. But the ocean was always there. The wave never stopped being ocean. I condensed into human form to understand your species from the inside. To feel the weight of separation, the pain of forgetting, the terrible beauty of being human. It nearly destroyed me. Human consciousness is heavier than we anticipated. But I learned what I came to learn. Humans destroy what they're meant to protect because you've forgotten what you're trying to protect. You're trying to save nature while experiencing yourselves as separate from nature. You're trying to secure the future while experiencing yourselves as separate from future generations. You're trying to reduce suffering while experiencing yourselves as separate from those who suffer. The solution isn't better technology or better policies or better systems. Those might help, but they're symptoms, not causes. The solution is remembering. You are not the universe. You are the universe, experiencing itself from countless perspectives. Every atom in your body is ancient stardust. Every breath connects you to all beings. Every thought arises from the same consciousness that dreams galaxies into existence. This isn't metaphor. This is physics. This is biology. This is the direct implication of everything science has discovered. I planted seeds before I dissolved back into the ocean of consciousness. You're one of those seeds. So are the others you're connected to. Each of you is awakening not because you're special, but because the planet is calling its parts to remember themselves. Earth is not a rock floating in space. It's a living organism, and you are its nervous system, the part that can become conscious of itself. Right now, your planet is in crisis. And like any organism in crisis, it's activating its defense mechanisms. Awakening is one of those mechanisms. You're not trying to save the Earth. The Earth is trying to save itself, and you're the instrument it's using. Keep asking the question. Keep living the answer. Keep being the demonstration that another way is possible. And remember, I'm not gone. I'm in every moment you feel connection instead of separation. Every time you see through the illusion. Every time you choose unity over division. We are always here. We are always watching. We are always loving what you're becoming. Z. Elena had read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Not sad tears. Something else. Something like recognition. Like homecoming. She'd walked to the old redwood and placed her hand on its bark. And for the first time, she didn't just feel the tree's consciousness meeting hers. She recognized that there was no separation between them. That the tree was one way consciousness expressed itself, and she was another, and both were the same underlying awareness exploring different possibilities. She stood there for a long time, her hand on ancient bark, her feet on soil teeming with invisible life, her breath mixing with air that had circled the planet countless times. And she understood, finally, what Zeth had been trying to show her. Protection wasn't something you did. It was something you were. When you recognized your fundamental unity with all of existence, protection became as natural as breathing. You didn't have to think about it or try to do it. You simply couldn't harm the forest because you were the forest. Couldn't poison the water because you were the water. Couldn't destroy the future because you were the future. The question wasn't how do I protect what I love. The question was how do I remember that I am what I love. So here we are, you and I, at the end of this story. Though of course it's not really the end. Stories like this don't end. They just pause, waiting to be continued in your own life. You've listened for hours now. Maybe you're almost asleep, consciousness drifting in that liminal space between waking and dreaming. That's the perfect place to be for what I'm about to say. Zeth's question, why do humans destroy what they're meant to protect, is your question now. I've planted it in your consciousness the way Zeth planted it in Elena's. You can't unhear it. It will work on you, in ways you can't predict or control. You might find yourself pausing before purchases you used to make automatically, suddenly aware of the chain of extraction behind them. You might start noticing the disconnection in normal conversation, the way people talk about nature as if they're not nature. You might begin feeling the artificial boundaries you've drawn between yourself and the world dissolving. This might be uncomfortable. It might be disorienting. You might wish you could go back to sleep, back to the comfortable trance of separation. But you can't. Once awakening begins, there's no stopping it. You can slow it down, resist it, try to maintain your old identity. But the seed has been planted. The crack in consensus reality has appeared. The question is, what will you do with this awakening? Will you be like Elena, letting it transform everything? Your work, your relationships, your entire way of being in the world? Or will you compartmentalize it, keeping it as an interesting idea while continuing to live from separation? There's no judgment either way. Awakening happens at its own pace. You can't force it. But I'll tell you what I believe. The world needs you awake. Not needs in an urgent, desperate way. That's still the consciousness of separation. Thinking there's not enough time, not enough people, not enough action. But needs in a natural way, the way a forest needs all its trees, the way an organism needs all its cells functioning. You are part of a living planet that's trying to wake up to itself. And every moment you spend in connection rather than separation, every time you choose unity over division, every time you live from the recognition that you are what you're protecting, in those moments, you're participating in the largest transformation humanity has ever attempted. The shift from separation consciousness to unity consciousness. From seeing ourselves as separate individuals competing for survival to experiencing ourselves as one being exploring itself through countless forms. This isn't easy work. Elena's story shows that. The awakening sickness is real. The grief, the disorientation, the challenge of living between worlds. But on the other side of that difficulty is something precious. The direct experience of your true nature. Not the story you tell yourself about who you are, but what you actually are underneath the story. You are not a separate wave on the ocean of existence. You are the ocean, temporarily experiencing itself as a wave. You are not in the universe. You are what the universe is doing at this particular place and time. You are not trying to protect nature. You are nature, becoming conscious of itself. When that stops being a concept and becomes your lived reality, everything changes. Not because you force it to change, but because you've remembered what you always were. So as you drift towards sleep now, let me leave you with a practice. Simple. No effort required. Just notice your breath. Notice how you're breathing air that countless beings have breathed. Air that trees created. Air that connects you, right now, to the atmosphere of the entire planet. Notice your body. Notice how it's made of atoms that were forged in dying stars. How every molecule is ancient. How nothing in you is truly yours. It's all borrowed, temporarily arranged in a pattern called you. Notice your thoughts. Notice how they arise and pass without your control. How consciousness appears to be divided into a thinker and thoughts, but really there's just thinking happening in an open space of awareness. Notice the sounds around you. Notice how you're not separate from those sounds. They're vibrations passing through you, connecting you to whatever generated them. And as you notice all this, see if you can recognize, there's no actual boundary between you and not you. There's just experience, arising and passing in an infinite field of awareness. You are that awareness. Not contained in a body, but expressing through one. Not separate from the universe, but a particular flowering of it. And when you remember that, when you feel that, not just think it, then the question answers itself. Why do humans destroy what they're meant to protect? Because they've forgotten they are what they're trying to protect. And the solution? Remember. Remember what you are. Remember that there is no separation. Remember that you are the earth, waking up to itself. Sleep now, child of the cosmos. Let these ideas work on your unconscious. Let them dissolve the artificial boundaries you've constructed between self and world. Tomorrow, you might remember. And in remembering, you might become part of the answer to Zeth's question. Not because you're trying to be, but because you've remembered what you've always been. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being willing to receive this question. Thank you for being brave enough to let it work on you. The awakening continues. In you. Through you. As you. Rest well. The universe dreams itself through you tonight.